The millionaire forced her daughter to marry a humble farmer, never imagining the impact it would have on their lives. The sun rose lazily over the rooftops of the Anderson mansion, its golden rays sneaking through the silk curtains of Elizabeth's room. The young heiress tossed and turned between, the sheets ignoring the persistent knocking at her door. "Elizabeth, Elizabeth, wake up now! Your mother wants to see you in the study immediately." The housekeeper's shrill voice echoed throughout the room. Elizabeth groaned, burying her face in the pillow. At 25, she was still behaving like a rebellious teenager, much to the despair of her stepmother, Catherine. With a sigh of resignation, she slowly sat up, her long black hair cascading over her shoulders. I'm coming," she muttered, dragging her feet towards the bathroom. As she got ready, Elizabeth couldn't help but feel a pang of anxiety. Summons to Catherine's study never boded well. Since her father's death 3 years ago, the relationship between the two had deteriorated into a cold war of icy glares and biting comments. 20 minutes later, Elizabeth found herself in front of the imposing oak door of the study. She took a deep breath and knocked softly. "Come in." Catherine's cold voice was heard from inside. Elizabeth entered, finding her stepmother's impeccably dressed figure. Catherine, at 50, was still a beautiful woman, with her platinum blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun and her piercing blue eyes fixed on the young woman. "Sit down, Elizabeth," Catherine ordered, pointing to the chair in front of her desk. Elizabeth obeyed, crossing her legs and raising an eyebrow defiantly. "What is it now, Catherine? Did the gardeners complain because I stepped on the roses again?" Catherine ignored the sarcasm, her lips forming a tense line. "It's time we talked about your future, Elizabeth. You've been living like a spoiled princess for far too long. It's time you took on some responsibilities." Elizabeth let out a bitter laugh. "Responsibilities? You mean the companies my father left me that you manage as if they were yours?" Catherine's eyes flashed dangerously. "Those companies need someone mature and capable at the helm. You, my dear, are nowhere near ready." "And who says that, you?" Elizabeth leaned forward, her brown eyes shining with defiance. "I'm the rightful heir. Those companies are mine by right." Catherine slowly stood up, circling the desk until she was in front of Elizabeth. "Heir, what an interesting word. Have you ever wondered why you don't look anything like your father?" Elizabeth felt her heart stop for a moment. "What do you mean?" Catherine smiled, a cold, calculating smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, nothing important. I was just wondering if you really know your place in this family." Before Elizabeth could respond, Catherine continued. "But that's not what I wanted to talk to you about today. I've made a decision about your future, Elizabeth. It's time for you to get married." The young woman jumped up, her eyes wide open. "What? Are you crazy? You can't decide that for me." "Oh, but I can," Catherine replied calmly. "As your legal guardian until you're 30, according to your father's will, I have the authority to make decisions about your welfare, and I've decided that you need a husband who will teach you the value of hard work and humility." Elizabeth stepped back, shaking her head in disbelief. "You can't do this. I won't allow it." Catherine moved closer, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You can resist, of course, but remember, dear, that I have the power to make your life very, very difficult. Do you really want to defy me?" At that moment, a knock on the door interrupted the tense scene. "Come in," Catherine called, without taking her eyes off Elizabeth. The door opened, revealing a young man about 30 years old, dressed in simple but clean clothes. He had messy brown hair and several days' worth of stubble. But what stood out most were his intense, piercing green eyes. "Ah, Jack, right on time," said Catherine, her tone changing to a falsely sweet one. "Elizabeth, I want to introduce you to Jack Miller, your future husband." Elizabeth felt the world stop around her. She looked at Jack, then at Catherine, and back at Jack. The man seemed as surprised as she was, his green eyes wide open. "This is a joke, right?" Elizabeth finally managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. Catherine smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Not at all, dear. Jack is an honest worker, owner of a small farm on the outskirts of the city. I think he'll be an excellent influence on you." Jack stepped forward, extending a calloused hand towards Elizabeth. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Anderson," he said, his voice deep and soft at the same time. Elizabeth ignored the outstretched hand, turning to Catherine with fury in her eyes. "You can't force me to marry a farmer. This is ridiculous." "Watch your words, Elizabeth," Catherine warned. "Jack is a respectable and hard-working man, exactly what you need to straighten out your path." Jack slowly lowered his hand, a shadow of pain crossing his face, at Elizabeth's evident contempt. "Mrs. Anderson, I don't understand. I thought you had called me to discuss a loan for my farm." Catherine turned to him, her calculating smile back on her face. "Oh, Jack, this is much better than a loan with this marriage. You'll have access to resources you never even dreamed of. All you have to do is help Elizabeth mature and become a responsible woman." Elizabeth couldn't believe what she was hearing. She felt like she was trapped in a surreal nightmare. "You can't decide this for me. I absolutely refuse." Catherine approached her, lowering her voice so only Elizabeth could hear. "Think about it carefully, dear. If you refuse, I might start asking questions about your legitimacy as an heir. Do you really want to risk losing everything?" The color drained from Elizabeth's face. What did Catherine know? Was there any truth to her earlier insinuations? Doubt was sown in her mind, and for a moment she felt completely lost Jack, oblivious to the private conversation between the two. Women seemed increasingly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Anderson, with all due respect, I can't accept this. I don't know your daughter and—" "Nonsense!" Catherine interrupted him. "You'll have plenty of time to get to know each other. The wedding will be in a month." "A month?" Elizabeth exclaimed, coming out of her stupor. "This is madness. I'm not going to listen to this nonsense anymore." With those words, Elizabeth headed for the door, but Catherine stopped her with a firm hand on her arm. "Think carefully, Elizabeth. Remember what's at stake." Elizabeth jerked away abruptly and ran out of the study, leaving a confused Jack and a smiling Catherine behind. The following weeks were a whirlwind of frantic preparations and heated discussions Elizabeth resisted with all her might. But Catherine held all the cards, with the veiled threat of revealing a secret that Elizabeth didn't even know. The young heiress found herself trapped in a web of manipulation and emotional blackmail. Jack, for his part, tried several times to talk to Elizabeth, to explain that he didn't agree with this arrangement either, but the young woman avoided him like the plague. To her, he represented everything she hated about this situation: the loss of her freedom, Catherine's betrayal, and a future she had never imagined for herself. As the wedding day approached, Elizabeth sank deeper and deeper into despair. She tried to seek legal help, but discovered that Catherine had been very clever in manipulating her father's will. Without concrete evidence of embezzlement or abuse of power, Elizabeth found herself legally bound to her stepmother's decisions until she turned 30. The night before the wedding, Elizabeth was in her room, looking out the window at the extensive gardens of the Anderson mansion. Silent tears ran down her cheeks as she contemplated the life she was about to leave behind. A soft knock on the door startled her. "Come in," she said, quickly wiping away her tears. To her surprise, it was Jack who entered. He looked uncomfortable and out of place in the luxurious room, his calloused hands nervously twisting the hat he was carrying. "Miss Elizabeth," he began, his voice soft and calm, "I know you don't want to see me, but I needed to talk to you before tomorrow." Elizabeth turned, crossing her arms over her chest. "What do you want? Have you come to gloat about your luck? To brag about how you've managed to marry a rich heiress?" Jack shook his head, a pained expression crossing his face. "No, nothing like that. I've come to tell you that I'm sorry, that I never wanted to be part of this." "Then why did you accept?" Elizabeth asked, her voice filled with bitterness. Jack sighed deeply. "Because I had no choice, your stepmother. She threatened to take away my farm if I didn't accept. It's all I have left of—" He stopped abruptly, as if he had been about to reveal something painful. Elizabeth, despite her anger, couldn't help but feel curious. "Of what?" she asked, her voice softer now. Jack shook his head. "It doesn't matter. What I want to say is that I understand how you feel. We're both trapped in this." For the first time since she met him, Elizabeth really looked at Jack. She saw the honesty in his eyes, the weariness in his posture. He wasn't the villain she had imagined, but another victim of Catherine's games. "What are we going to do?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jack slowly moved closer, as if afraid of startling her. "I don't know, but maybe if we work together we can find a way out." Elizabeth looked at him, surprised by the determination in his voice. For a moment, she felt a spark of hope. "Maybe," she replied, allowing herself a small smile. As Jack said goodbye and left the room, Elizabeth was left thinking tomorrow she would marry this man, leave behind the life of luxury she knew, and face an uncertain future. But for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel completely alone. The wedding day dawned cloudy, as if the sky itself reflected the mood of the bride and groom. The ceremony was a small and somber affair, with Catherine presiding over everything with a smile of satisfaction that made Elizabeth's blood boil. When the priest pronounced the fateful words, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Elizabeth felt a part of her die. She looked at Jack, saw the compassion in his eyes, and knew that at least in this, she wasn't alone. That same afternoon, with barely time to change from the wedding dress into more comfortable clothes, Elizabeth found herself climbing into an old pickup truck with Jack. Her suitcases, full of designer clothes and expensive jewelry, seemed out of place in the rickety vehicle. As they drove away from the Anderson mansion, Elizabeth looked in the rearview mirror. She saw Catherine standing at the entrance, her triumphant smile visible even from a distance. At that moment, Elizabeth vowed that someday she would return, and when she did, it would be to reclaim what was rightfully hers. The journey to Jack's farm was long and silent. Elizabeth looked out the window, watching as the urban landscape gradually gave way to fields and meadows. When they finally arrived, the sun was already setting. Jack's farm was small but cozy, a two-story wooden house, surrounded by cultivated fields and a small barn. To Elizabeth, accustomed to the luxury and opulence of the Anderson mansion, it looked like something out of an old postcard. "Welcome to your new home," said Jack, his voice tinged with a mixture of nervousness and pride. Elizabeth got out of the truck, her designer shoes sinking slightly into the loose earth. She looked around, a mix of conflicting emotions battling inside her. On one hand, she felt a deep sense of loss and resentment. On the other, a small part of her couldn't help but feel intrigued by the tranquility and simplicity of the place. "It's different," she finally managed to say, trying to maintain a neutral tone. Jack smiled slightly, as if he had expected a much worse reaction. "I know it's probably not what you're used to, but I promise you it has its charm." As Jack unloaded the suitcases, Elizabeth ventured to take a few steps around the property. The scent of damp earth and fresh grass filled the air, so different from the expensive perfumes and leather smell of the mansion. In the distance, she could hear the soft mooing of some cows and the distant clucking of chickens. "Do you want to go inside?" Jack's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "You must be tired after the trip." Elizabeth nodded silently and followed him into the house. The interior was modest but cozy, worn but well-maintained wooden furniture, floral curtains on the windows, and a stone fireplace dominated the main room. "Your room is upstairs," said Jack, pointing to a staircase. "I prepared it for you. I hope it's comfortable." Elizabeth climbed the stairs, followed by Jack carrying her suitcases. The room was small compared to her suite in the mansion, but it was clean and tidy. A bed with a patchwork quilt, an oak wardrobe, and a small desk by the window made up the furniture. "I'll leave you to get settled," said Jack, leaving the suitcases by the door. "If you need anything, I'll be downstairs." When Jack left, gently closing the door behind him, Elizabeth finally allowed herself to collapse. She sat on the bed, the tears she had been holding back all day, finally flowing freely. She cried for the life she had left behind, for the injustice of her situation, and for the fear of a future she had never imagined for herself. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Jack moved nervously, preparing a simple dinner. He too felt overwhelmed by the situation. He had never imagined he would marry like this, much less to a woman like Elizabeth. Guilt gnawed at him inside, knowing he was part of the reason she was suffering. As night fell, The house sank into an uncomfortable silence. Elizabeth didn't come down for dinner, and Jack didn't dare to disturb her. They both spent their first night as husband and wife separated by a wooden floor and a world of differences. The following days were a period of difficult adjustment for both of them. Elizabeth, accustomed to a life of luxury and leisure, suddenly found herself in a world where hard work was the norm. Jack tried to be patient, but Elizabeth's lack of experience in the most basic household and farm tasks often frustrated him. One morning, about a week after their arrival, Elizabeth woke up to the sound of angry voices coming from outside. She looked out the window and saw Jack arguing heatedly with a man in a suit holding a briefcase. Curious and a little alarmed, Elizabeth quickly got dressed and went downstairs. When she stepped onto the porch, the man in the suit was already leaving Jack with a worried expression on his face. "What was that?" Elizabeth asked, surprising herself with her genuine curiosity. Jack looked at her, as if weighing whether he should share his problems with her. Finally, he sighed and said, "It was from the bank. They're threatening to foreclose on the farm if I don't pay the arrears this month." Elizabeth felt a pang of guilt. She had been so absorbed in her own misery that she hadn't stopped to think about the problems Jack might be facing. "How much do you owe?" she asked, surprising Jack with her interest. "More than I can pay right now," he replied, running a hand through his hair in frustration. The harvest wasn't good last year, and with the low prices, Elizabeth bit her lip, thoughtful. All her life she had been surrounded by money, but she had never stopped to think about how it was really earned. Seeing Jack, a man who worked hard every day on the verge of losing everything, made her feel something she hadn't experienced before. The desire to help. Maybe I could help," she said timidly. "I don't know much about farms or crops, but I know about numbers and finances. I could take a look at your accounts, see if there's any way to reorganize things." Jack looked at her with surprise and a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "You'd do that? I thought you hated all of this." Elizabeth shrugged, feeling a little uncomfortable under Jack's grateful gaze. "Well, I guess if I'm going to be here, I might as well be useful." That afternoon, Elizabeth immersed herself in the farm's accounting books. To her surprise, she found that she enjoyed the challenge of unraveling the numbers and looking for solutions. As she worked, Jack explained the ins and outs of the agricultural business, and she found herself fascinated by the complexity and risks involved. As the days passed, Elizabeth and Jack began to form an unexpected team. She contributed her financial knowledge and business education, while he shared his practical experience and knowledge of the land. Gradually, the tension between them began to dissipate, replaced by a growing mutual respect. One night, as they ate dinner together, something that had become a habit, Elizabeth finally dared to ask the question that had been on her mind. "Jack," she began, hesitating for a moment before continuing, "why did you accept this marriage? I know you mentioned that Catherine threatened to take away your farm, but wasn't there another option?" Jack put down his fork and looked at Elizabeth with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "The truth is that this farm is all I have left of my family. My parents built it from scratch, and when they passed away a few years ago, I swore I'd keep it running no matter what." Elizabeth felt a wave of empathy. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." Jack shook his head. "Don't apologize. It's not something I talk about much. But yes, when your stepmother showed up with her proposal, I felt like I had no choice. This farm is my home, my heritage. I couldn't lose it." Elizabeth nodded, truly understanding Jack's position. For the first time, "I understand. I'm fighting for my inheritance too, albeit in a different way." "Can I ask you something?" Jack said after a moment of silence. When Elizabeth nodded, he continued, "What did your stepmother mean when she hinted that you weren't really part of the family?" Elizabeth felt her heart racing. The question she had been avoiding thinking about since that day in Catherine's study finally came to light. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "But I'm afraid to find out. What if it turns out I'm not who I always thought I was?" Jack reached across the table, gently taking Elizabeth's hand. It was a simple gesture, but full of understanding and support. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together. After all, we're in this together, aren't we?" Elizabeth looked at their joined hands, and for the first time since she arrived at the farm, felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this forced marriage could turn into an unexpected alliance. Meanwhile, in the Anderson mansion, Catherine paced her study, a glass of red wine in her hand. Her plan was in motion, but she couldn't help feeling a twinge of unease. She had underestimated Elizabeth before, and she couldn't afford to make that mistake again. She picked up her phone and dialed a number. "I need you to watch the farm," she ordered. Without preamble, "I want to know every move Elizabeth and that farmer make and prepare the documents we discussed. Soon it will be time to put the next phase of the plan into action." As she hung up, Catherine looked at the portrait of her late husband hanging on the wall. "I'm sorry, darling," she murmured, "but I won't let your dear adopted daughter take away what's rightfully mine." With a cold smile, Catherine raised her glass in a silent toast. The game had only just begun, and she was determined to win no matter the cost. Days on the farm turned into weeks and weeks into months. As summer gave way to fall, Elizabeth found herself adapting to her new life in a way she never would have imagined. The long work days, which at first seemed like torture, now gave her a sense of accomplishment she had never experienced in her life of luxury. One cool October morning, Elizabeth woke. Up before dawn, something that had become habitual. She quickly dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt, an outfit she would have despised a few months ago, but now appreciated for its comfort and practicality. She went down to the kitchen and was surprised to find Jack already awake, bent over the table with a worried expression on his face. "Jack, is everything okay?" she asked, approaching him. Jack looked up, startled. "Elizabeth, I didn't hear you come down. It's nothing, I was just going over some bills." Elizabeth frowned, not convinced by his evasive answer. She sat down across from him and reached out to take the papers Jack was trying to hide. "Let me see," she said firmly. Jack hesitated for a moment, but finally gave in. Elizabeth examined the documents, her frown deepening as she read. They were overdue payment notices, foreclosure threats, and a letter from the local bank informing them of the denial of a loan. "Jack, why didn't you tell me things were this bad?" she asked, feeling a mix of concern and frustration. Jack sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair with a tired gesture. "I didn't want to worry you. You've already had to adapt to so many changes. Besides, these are my problems, not yours." Elizabeth felt a pang of pain at his words. "I thought we had agreed that we were in this together. Your problems are my problems now, whether you like it or not." Jack looked at her in surprise, a small smile forming on his lips. "You're right, I'm sorry. It's just that I've never had to share these worries with anyone before." Elizabeth nodded, understanding. In the past few months, she had come to know Jack as a proud but compassionate man, someone who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders without complaining. "Well, let's share them now," Elizabeth said determinedly. "Tell me everything I want to know, exactly what we're facing." For the next hour, as the sun began to peek over the horizon, Jack explained the farm's financial situation. The poor harvests of recent years, combined with falling agricultural product prices, had left the farm on the brink of bankruptcy. The bank was refusing to grant more loans, and suppliers were starting to demand upfront payments. Elizabeth listened attentively, her mind working at full speed. As Jack spoke, she began to see patterns, to form ideas. "Jack," she interrupted suddenly, "have you considered diversifying? I mean, besides traditional crops." Jack looked at her curiously. "What do you mean?" "Well, I've been reading about sustainable agriculture and organic products. There's a growing market for that kind of thing, and the profit margins are much higher." Jack looked thoughtful. "I've heard something about that, but it always seemed too risky to change what we've been doing for generations." Elizabeth leaned forward, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "But that's precisely the point. The world is changing and we have to adapt. Besides, I'm not suggesting we change everything at once. We could start with a small part of the land, as an experiment." As they discussed, the sun rose in the sky, bathing the kitchen in a golden light. Elizabeth and Jack were so absorbed in their conversation that they didn't notice the passage of time. For the first time, they were working together as a true team, their different experiences and perspectives complementing each other in a way neither of them would have imagined possible a few months ago. Meanwhile, miles away in the luxurious Anderson mansion, Catherine was preparing to set the next phase of her plan in motion. Sitting in her study, she reviewed a series of legal documents with her lawyer, a stern-looking man named Richard Vega. "Are you sure you want to proceed with this, Mrs. Anderson?" Richard asked, his voice laden with concern. "Once we initiate this process, there's no turning back." Catherine looked up from the papers, her eyes shining with cold determination. "Absolutely sure, Richard. Elizabeth has had more than enough time to mature on that miserable farm. It's time for her to understand that she will never have control of Anderson Enterprises." Richard nodded slowly. "Very well. I'll file the petition to invalidate Mr. Anderson's will tomorrow morning. Based on the information you provided, we have a solid case to argue that Elizabeth has no legal right to the inheritance." Catherine smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Excellent, and remember, Richard, absolute discretion. No one must know about this until it's too late for Elizabeth to do anything about it." As Richard gathered his things and prepared to leave, Catherine stood up and walked to the window. She looked out at the extensive gardens of the mansion, thinking about how she had come to this point. She remembered the day she met Edward Anderson, Elizabeth's father. She was an ambitious young woman. Working as his personal assistant, Edward was a powerful, charismatic man, and Catherine fell madly in love with him. Or at least, that's what she told herself. The truth was that Catherine had fallen in love with the idea of the power and wealth that Edward represented. When he proposed marriage after the death of his first wife, Catherine saw her opportunity to climb the social ladder and secure her future. What she didn't expect was Elizabeth the girl, then 5 years old, was a constant reminder that Catherine would never truly be first in Edward's heart. As Elizabeth grew, Catherine watched how Edward adored her, how he planned to leave the entire Anderson empire to his beloved daughter. Bitterness and jealousy grew in Catherine's heart over the years. When Edward died suddenly, leaving Elizabeth as his sole heir, Catherine vowed she would do everything possible to ensure the Anderson fortune remained in her hands. The sound of her phone snapped her out of her memories. It was a message from her informant in the town near Jack's farm. Miss Elizabeth and Mr. Miller were seen at the local agricultural cooperative. They seemed to be discussing new farming methods. Catherine frowned. This wasn't what she had expected. Elizabeth was supposed to be miserable, not adapting. For a moment, she felt a twinge of doubt. Had she underestimated her stepdaughter? She shook her head, ridding herself of those thoughts. It didn't matter. With the documents Richard would file tomorrow, soon Elizabeth would find herself with nothing. No Anderson fortune, no farm, nothing. "Enjoy your little country adventure while you can, dear," Catherine murmured, a cruel smile curving her lips, "because very soon your world will crumble around you." Back at the farm, oblivious to Catherine's machinations, Elizabeth and Jack spent the rest of the day working on their new plan. They visited different areas of the property, discussing which plots might be suitable for starting their organic crop experiment. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, they found themselves sitting on the back porch of the house, exhausted but satisfied with the day's progress. "You know," Jack said, looking at Elizabeth with a mixture of admiration and gratitude, "when you arrived here, I never imagined you'd become such a vital part of this farm. Thank you, Elizabeth, for not giving up, for helping me see things differently." Elizabeth felt herself blushing under Jack's intense gaze. "I thank you, Jack, for being patient with me, for teaching me so much. I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad to be here." For a moment, they looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. Then, almost without realizing it, Jack leaned forward. Elizabeth held her breath, her heart beating rapidly in her chest. The moment was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching. They quickly separated like teenagers caught by their parents. "Are we expecting anyone?" Elizabeth asked, trying to calm her racing heart. Jack frowned, standing up. "Not that I know of." They headed towards the front of the house just as an elegant black car stopped in front of the entrance. Elizabeth felt her heart stop when she saw who was getting out of the vehicle. "Catherine," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Catherine Anderson, impeccably dressed in a designer suit, advanced towards them with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Elizabeth, darling," she said, her voice sweet, but with an underlying tone of malice. "Aren't you going to greet your stepmother?" Elizabeth stepped forward, instinctively placing herself between Catherine and Jack. "What are you doing here, Catherine?" Catherine's smile widened, sending chills down Elizabeth's spine. "Oh dear, is that any way to greet the woman who raised you? Especially when I bring such interesting news." Elizabeth felt Jack's hand on her back, a silent gesture of support. She straightened up, facing Catherine with a determination she didn't know she possessed. "What news?" she asked, her voice firm, despite the fear she felt inside. Catherine pulled an envelope from her purse and waved it in front of Elizabeth. "I think it's time you learned the truth about your past, dear, and about your future." As the sun set on the horizon, bathing the scene in a reddish light, Elizabeth felt the world stop around her. Whatever that envelope contained, she knew it was about to change her life forever. The silence that followed Catherine's words was so dense it could almost be cut with a knife. Elizabeth stared fixedly at the envelope in her stepmother's hand, her mind racing with all the possibilities of what it might contain. "What is that?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. Catherine smiled, a cold, calculating smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, darling, why don't we go inside and discuss this as a family? After all, that's what we are, aren't we?" Elizabeth felt Jack's hand on her back, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone. She straightened up, facing Catherine with a determination she didn't know she possessed. "Whatever you have to say, Catherine, you can say it here and now," Elizabeth said, her voice firmer than she felt. Catherine arched an eyebrow, her smile turning even colder. "As you wish, dear, always so impatient." She opened the envelope and pulled out a set of documents. "You know, I always wondered why you didn't look anything like your father. Turns out there was a very good reason for that." Elizabeth felt her heart racing. "What do you mean?" Catherine held out the documents. "You're adopted, Elizabeth. Your father picked you up from an orphanage when you were just a baby. These are the adoption papers." The world seemed to stop around Elizabeth. She took the documents with trembling hands, her eyes scanning, the words that confirmed what Catherine had just said. She felt short of breath, as if the ground was moving beneath her feet. This can't be true," she murmured, more to herself than to the others. Catherine let out a humorless laugh. "Oh, but it is, dear. And that's not all you see. According to the laws of our country, an adopted child doesn't have the same inheritance rights as a biological child, unless explicitly specified in the will. And guess what? Your father forgot to make that little clarification." Elizabeth looked up from the documents, shock giving way to anger. "What are you saying, Catherine?" "I'm saying, dear Elizabeth, that you have no legal right to the Anderson fortune. Everything, the companies, the properties, everything belongs to me now." Jack stepped forward, placing himself next to Elizabeth. "That's impossible, Mr. Anderson loved. Elizabeth, everyone knew that he wouldn't have let something like this happen." Catherine turned to Jack, her eyes gleaming with malice. "Ah, the brave farmer to the rescue, how touching. But I'm afraid love means nothing in the face of the law. I filed a petition to invalidate Edward's will. This morning, in a matter of weeks, everything will officially be mine." Elizabeth felt her legs give way. Jack held her, preventing her from falling. "Why, Catherine?" Elizabeth managed to ask, her voice broken with emotion. "Why now? Why do all this?" Catherine moved closer, her face inches from Elizabeth's. "Because you were never more than an obstacle to me, dear. A constant reminder that no matter how hard I tried, I would never be first, in Edward's heart. But now finally I'll have everything I deserve." With those words, Catherine turned and began walking towards her car. Before getting in, she turned one last time. "Oh, and one more thing. The mortgage on this lovely little farm, it's in my name now too. You have a week to vacate. Goodbye, dears." Catherine's car drove away, leaving behind a cloud of dust and 2 broken hearts. Elizabeth collapsed in Jack's arms, the tears finally flowing freely. Jack held her in silence, his own mind trying to process everything that had just happened. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions and frantic activity. Elizabeth and Jack desperately sought a way to fight against Catherine's actions. They consulted with lawyers, reviewed old documents, looked for anything that could help them challenge Catherine's petition. But with each door that closed, with each hope that faded, Elizabeth felt a part of her die. The revelation of her adoption had shaken the foundations of her identity, and the imminent loss of everything she had ever known left her feeling adrift one night. As Elizabeth sat on the back porch, looking at the stars and feeling more lost than ever, Jack joined her. He sat down beside her in silence, offering his presence as comfort. "You know?" Elizabeth said after a long silence. "I always knew Catherine didn't like me, but I never imagined she would go this far." Jack took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "I'm so sorry. Elizabeth, I wish I could do more to help." Elizabeth looked at him, a small, sad smile on her lips. "You've done more than you think, Jack. Without you, I don't know how I would have survived all this." They looked into each other's eyes, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade. Away slowly, almost as if it were a dream, they leaned towards each other. Their lips met in a soft kiss, full of understanding, comfort, and something more, something neither of them dared to name yet. When they separated, Elizabeth rested her head on Jack's shoulder. "What are we going to do now?" she asked quietly. Jack hugged her tightly. "I don't know, but whatever it is, we'll face it together, I promise you that." Meanwhile, in the Anderson mansion, Catherine celebrated her imminent victory. Surrounded by the luxurious possessions that would soon be officially hers, she felt drunk with power. However, her celebration was interrupted by a phone call. It was Richard, her lawyer. "Mrs. Anderson," said Richard, his voice tense, "we have a problem." Catherine felt her euphoria fading. "What kind of problem?" "Someone has filed an objection to our petition to invalidate the will. Someone who claims to have evidence that Mr. Anderson did specify that Elizabeth should inherit everything, regardless of her adoption status." Catherine felt her blood run cold. "Who?" she demanded. "Who dares to stand in my way?" There was a moment of silence on the line before Richard answered. "Emily Parker, Mr. Anderson's former secretary." Catherine almost dropped the phone. Emily Parker, a name she hadn't heard in years, a woman Catherine thought she had eliminated from the equation long ago. "Impossible," Catherine whispered. She can't." "I'm afraid she can, Mrs. Anderson," said Richard. "And there's more. Emily says she has evidence not only about the will, but about other things. Things that, according to her, could send us all to jail." Catherine felt the world crumbling around her, her carefully crafted plan, years of manipulation and deceit were in danger of being exposed. "Find her," she ordered Richard, her voice shaking with rage. "Find her, and make sure she can never speak." As she hung up the phone, Catherine looked at Edward Anderson's portrait hanging above the fireplace. For the first time in years, she felt fear. Fear of losing everything. Fear of her crimes coming to light. "I won't let them take it away from me," she muttered, her eyes shining with fierce determination. "Not now. Not when I'm so close." Miles away, in a small apartment in the city, an older woman looked out the window, a stack of old documents in her hands. Emily Parker knew she had just unleashed a storm, but after years of silence and guilt, she was finally ready to face the consequences of the truth. "It's time, Edward," she said quietly, as if speaking to an old friend. "It's time for your daughter to know the whole truth." As the night progressed, the threads of fate began to intertwine. Elizabeth, struggling to find her place in a world that suddenly seemed alien. Jack, determined to protect the woman who, against all odds, he had come to love. Catherine, willing to do anything to maintain her empire of lies. And Emily, bearer of secrets that had the power to change everything. The storm was approaching, and no one was prepared for the revelations it would bring. The morning dawned grey and rainy, as if the sky itself reflected the emotional turmoil that was brewing. Elizabeth woke to the sound of rain beating against the farmhouse roof, her eyes swollen from another night of tears and restless dreams. Beside her, Jack slept deeply. His arm protectively wrapped around her, Elizabeth looked at him with a mixture of tenderness and guilt. Amidst all the chaos, somehow they had found comfort in each other. But for how much longer could they maintain this bubble of peace? Careful not to wake Jack, Elizabeth got up and headed to the kitchen. As she prepared coffee, her mind wandered over the events of the past few days. The revelation of her adoption, Catherine's betrayal, the imminent loss of everything she had ever known, it all seemed too much to bear. The sound of a car approaching snapped her out of her thoughts. Frowning, Elizabeth peered out the window. They weren't expecting visitors, especially not so early in the morning. To her surprise, she saw an older woman getting out of a taxi. The woman, with grey hair and an elegant posture, looked around with a nostalgic expression before heading towards the front. Elizabeth opened the door before the woman could knock. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice mixed with curiosity and caution. The woman looked at her, her eyes filling with tears. "Elizabeth," she said softly, "you've grown so much. You're the spitting image of your mother." Elizabeth took a step back, surprised. "Who are you? How do you know my mother?" The woman smiled sadly. "My name is Emily Parker. I was your father's secretary for many years, and I've come to tell you the truth, the whole truth." At that moment, Jack appeared behind Elizabeth, alarmed by the voices. "Is everything okay?" he asked, placing a protective hand on Elizabeth's shoulder. Elizabeth nodded slowly, not taking her eyes off Emily. "I hope so," she said. "Please, come in. I think we have a lot to talk about." Meanwhile, at the Anderson mansion, Catherine paced frantically in her study. She had spent the night awake, desperately trying to locate Emily Parker before she could reach Elizabeth. "How is it possible that you haven't found her?" "Yet," she yelled into the phone. "She's an old woman, for God's sake." On the other end of the line, Richard tried to calm her down. "We're doing everything we can, Mrs. Anderson. We've checked all the hotels in the city, but there's no trace of her." Catherine hung up the phone in fury. She walked to the bar and poured herself a glass of whiskey, her hands shaking slightly. Her carefully crafted plan, years of manipulation and deceit, were about to crumble. Back at the farm, Elizabeth, Jack, and Emily were seated around the kitchen table. The atmosphere was charged with tension and anticipation. Emily pulled a thick envelope from her purse and placed it on the table. "Here's everything," she said. "Letters, documents, photographs, proof that your father always wanted you to inherit everything, Elizabeth, regardless of your adoption status." Elizabeth took the envelope with trembling hands. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why wait until now to tell me all this?" Emily lowered her gaze, guilt evident on her face. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Catherine, she's a dangerous woman. After your father's death, she threatened me. She said that if I ever spoke, she would destroy me, and I believed her." Jack frowned. What changed? "I'm dying," Emily said simply. "Cancer. The doctors say I have a few months left, and I realized that I couldn't take these secrets to the grave. Elizabeth deserves to know the truth." Elizabeth began to review the documents, her eyes widening more and more with each page she read. There were letters from her father, expressing his unconditional love, for her legal documents that clearly established her right to the inheritance, and then something that made her heart stop. This can't be true," she whispered. Emily nodded solemnly. "I'm afraid it is, dear Catherine. Not only tried to steal your inheritance, she was responsible for your father's death." Jack gasped, leaning in to read the documents Elizabeth was holding. They were medical reports, laboratory results, all indicating that Edward Anderson had been slowly poisoned over months. "Catherine was poisoning him," Emily said, her voice broken with emotion. "Your father began to suspect towards the end. He asked me to investigate in secret, but before we could do anything, he was gone." Elizabeth stood up abruptly, the chair falling to the floor behind her. "We have to take this to the police. Now." Jack stood up next to her, taking her hand. "I'm with you," he said simply. As they prepared to leave, the sound of screeching tires alerted them. Through the window, they saw several black cars, approaching at high speed. "It's Catherine," Elizabeth said, her voice mixed with fear and determination. Somehow she must have discovered that Emily is here. Emily stood up, her face pale but resolved. "Go," she told Elizabeth. "Take the documents to the police. I'll hold them off here." "No," Jack said firmly. "We won't leave you to face them alone." Elizabeth nodded, a new strength surging within her. "We're stronger together. We'll face this as a family." As the cars stopped in front of the house, Elizabeth, Jack, and Emily prepared for the final confrontation Catherine got out of. The first car, her face contorted with fury. "You!" she shouted, pointing at Emily. "Traitor! How dare you interfere in my affairs?" Elizabeth stepped forward, placing herself between Catherine and Emily. "It's over, Catherine. We know the truth. Everything." Catherine laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "And what are you going to do about it, dear? Run to the police? Do you think they'll believe you? I'm Catherine Anderson. I have connections, power. You're nobody." "You're wrong," Jack said, joining Elizabeth. "She's Elizabeth Anderson, the true heir of Edward Anderson. And she has proof of all your crimes." At that moment, the sound of sirens filled the air. Police cars appeared on the horizon, rapidly approaching. Catherine paled, taking a step back. "No, this can't be happening." "It's over, Catherine," Elizabeth said, her voice firm. "It's time for you to pay for everything you've done." As the police arrived and Catherine was arrested, Elizabeth turned to Jack and Emily. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace and belonging. "Thank you," she said, tears of relief and gratitude filling her eyes. "Both of you, for standing by me, for helping me discover the truth." Jack hugged her tightly. "I'll always be here for you, Elizabeth. I love you." Elizabeth looked at him, a smile lighting up her face. "I love you too, Jack. And now I understand that my home isn't a mansion or a fortune. My home is you, this farm, the life we've built together." Emily looked at them fondly. "Your father would be so proud of you, Elizabeth. You've faced adversity with grace and strength. You are truly his daughter." As the sun began to peek through the clouds, dispersing the rain, Elizabeth felt a new chapter of her life beginning, one filled with love, truth, and the promise of a bright future. 1 year later, the Anderson Miller farm was flourishing. Elizabeth and Jack had turned the property into a thriving organic farming business. Using Elizabeth's knowledge of finance and Jack's experience in the field, the Anderson fortune, now legally in Elizabeth's hands, was being used to help other struggling family farms and to fund sustainable agricultural education programs. Catherine, convicted of her crimes, would spend the rest of her days in prison, finally facing the consequences of her actions. Emily, though weakened by her illness, found peace in her last months, surrounded by the love and affection of the family she had helped reunite. And on a sunny spring afternoon, under the same tree where they had once shared their first kiss, Elizabeth and Jack were married, surrounded by friends, family, and the farm workers who had become their chosen family. As the sun set on the horizon, painting the sky in golden and pink hues, Elizabeth looked around her. At Jack, the man who had taught her the true meaning of love and perseverance, at the farm which had become her true home, and at the future, bright and full of possibilities. Elizabeth Anderson, once a reluctant heiress, was now the master of her own destiny, and she wouldn't change it for anything in the world.